Right, I'm very pleased to present to you the Right Honourable Baroness Frances de Souza, who, among other things, is a graduate of UCL in anthropology. So welcome back, Frances. It's great to have you with us. As you'll see from her short biography on the internet and the conference programme, Frances has held many different appointments, many of them very prestigious and many of them very strategically important in fields connected with development and with disasters. I recall that we first met in 1980 after the 1980 southern Italian earthquake, when we were both part of a mission to the south of Italy, which was actually one of the first and the pioneering post-earthquake data collection missions, and Frances did an anthropological study that I helped with. I remember in that we also were invited to the local mayor's house for dinner one evening, and it was a very riotous sort of affair. And next morning, Frances said to me with a slightly censorious tone to her voice, "You sang all the way down the hill," and all I could do was blame it on the wine that we'd been served up the night before. But Frances is a paragon of good sense and good judgment. As you can see from the note, she also has worked with UNDP, UNICEF, Save the Children, and the Overseas Development Institute, but she was one of the founders as well of Disasters Journal, which is the premier journal and the first one in the field, founded in 1976 by the London Technical Group, and then taken under the wing of the International Disaster Institute that Frances was the director of. That was very seminal in instigating change in the humanitarian field, and Frances ever since then has carried on being a force in arguing for change and looking critically at situations, which I think is what she's going to do in her talk today. She tells me she will talk for about 20 minutes, and then we can have a really good debate afterwards. So we look forward very much to that. Baroness de Souza, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David, for that kind introduction. Is this working? Yes. What David neglected to mention is that on that famous trip down to southern Italy, we were a motley crew, and he was a leader, and he was taking us, and we somehow managed to find ourselves camping on a roundabout.
You're right, I've forgotten that. Do you also remember that we had a football team which was the Universities of Cambridge, Oxford, London and Bristol, and we played against the earthquake victims and they won 16-0.
So what I'm going to talk about today, well, the clue really is in the title, and how far that actually fits in with the Institute for Risk and Disaster Reduction, I'm not entirely sure, but no doubt we will find out. My talk today, which I say we'll talk about 20-25 minutes, is in two parts. The first part is really, how does aid help nations function better? Now, this is a rather wide topic, so I'll narrow it down to what kind of conditions appear to be necessary for a reasonably successful nation state, one which enables the economic and political development of the various communities within it and a reduction in poverty. Now, one way to look at this is to consider the characteristics of failed or failing states, which I will do, but very briefly. The second part will look at what kind of aid that is provided by the big players, nearly always, I might add, in good faith, following devastation and the breakdown of the state and its major institutions from whatever causes, and we can perhaps then draw some conclusions as to the fit between what the needs are and the aid that is supplied. The essential question then is, what does aid currently perform and what capabilities does it have for performing them? An important subsidiary question is, do we have evidence-based answers to this? Development aid can be defined as financial packages to support economic, environmental, social, and economic growth in low-income countries. The premise here is that the role of the state is to build such infrastructure, but often lacking the capital authority and political will To do so tends to rely on foreign assistance. And aid now very often bridges the gap that governments and states should in fact themselves be filling. All of this will be very familiar to you. Now, much work has been done on failed states in recent years, not only because we have many, many examples, Iraq, Yemen, Syria, Afghanistan, Haiti, Libya, Somalia, but because some responsible people are deeply concerned as to how best to rebuild such broken countries in the interests of world peace. The Global Peace Index, which published its latest report last week, shows a strong correlation between economic growth and the absence of major conflict. And surely it should be the fundamental task of aid to develop to enable economic growth. There is, I would suggest, therefore, everything to be gained by understanding what kind of aid actually contributes to such growth. A major characteristic of failed states is a predominance of so-called extractive economic institutions which work to entrench the wealth of the elite at the expense of the majority. For example, Afghanistan or the DRC, the Democratic Republic of Congo, are countries which are extremely rich in natural resources, but cripplingly poor because their institutions are predominantly extractive. This results in lack of property rights, law and order, lack of law and order, lack of functioning legal systems, the frustration of entrepreneurial initiatives, and the obvious outcome, very poor infrastructure and non-existent public services. The local elites have dominance over political and economic life, and these factors almost guarantee the failure of foreign aid. Much of the aid, I would suggest, delivered to countries in the post-World War II world is based on a fundamental misunderstanding of what causes poverty. One interesting report from Afrobarometer, a relatively new organization doing very meticulous research, demonstrates by means of rigorous sampling that if governments provide infrastructure such as electricity, sewage, roads, water, communications, especially mobile cell phones, most communities will be on the road to successful development and the elimination of poverty. And of these, it seems, roads are the single most important factor in reducing poverty. The philosophy, therefore, here is hand up and not hand out assistance. Now, clearly, there are many factors that contribute to both failed and flourishing states. But for our purposes here, I want to single out those inputs that might serve to rebuild shattered communities. The goal of aid should be to support inclusive institutions whereby people can enter into decisions about what directly affects their lives and livelihoods. An associated and very important factor is the clear role that entrepreneurial activity contributes to the reduction of poverty and to the growth of inclusive institutions. With the logical conclusion that governments, aid packages, investments should encourage such activities. As we all know, aid is now a multi-billion-dollar international industry. I wonder, perhaps all of you do know, that the annual budget of the UN is $20 billion, but one which does not carry the same degree of rigorous evaluation as is the case in the commercial world. So let's look at the major aid packages provided for failed states in the aftermath of disasters such as earthquake, hurricane, tsunamis, and civil war. Obviously, there is a need for humanitarian relief. People whose lives and livelihoods have been destroyed overnight need food, and they need shelter. But the emergency contact is in most cases relatively short. Then so-called proper development begins. We are here talking about massive bilateral programs to build infrastructure, as well as aid agency projects to strengthen agricultural production, to provide clean water, primary health care, and education, as well as promoting the holy grail of modern development, which is education for girls, empowerment of women, and the emergence of local democratic procedures and institutions. On top of these rather tall orders, there is increasingly fierce insistence on monitoring and accountability, sometimes down to the very last bus ticket. What, however, tends to be lacking is a real effort to gather evidence-based research on the impact of development. If the missing component of successful aid is knowing what works and what doesn't in the medium to longer term, then surely we have to conclude that billions of dollars are being spent in a haphazard, hit or miss kind of way. So the issue is to assess the relevance of aid by means of long-term research on what works, together with an acknowledgement that bad aid is more than an unnecessary expenditure. It contributes to the breakdown of states. Now, again, as most of you will know, giving aid is a tricky business. It's difficult to accomplish and even trickier to evaluate. It's difficult to make ambitious, large-scale aid work, and it's especially difficult to improve the lot of the very poor. These basic problems are exacerbated by the fact that the goals of major aid programs are often very different and sometimes inadequately articulated. So goals can range from reducing the incidence and prevalence of waterborne diseases through increasing the income of a significant sector of the population to streamlining tax collection. The larger, more multifaceted and more ambitious the development program, the more difficult it is to predict the outcomes. That said, focused and contained projects that incorporate capacity building are effective and have long-term benefits, as for example in the case of immunization programs. These programs, as again you must know, are highly effective in reducing disease, in reducing health expenditure, and also in reducing poverty and in increasing economic impact. However, my friends, the nature of official development assistance is changing. Budgets grow ever larger, while at the same time there is reduced administrative support. I, some time ago, asked the Department for International Development to give a grant to a school that I set up in Afghanistan some 15, 16 years ago, which ticked all the boxes that DFID might have. And they said to me, well, okay, but can you handle £10 million? Well, no, of course I can't handle £10 million. But the inference was that it was not cost effective for the department to manage small grants. There has too been a massive increase in private sector delivery, which has advantages and disadvantages. The older model of development aid, a form of so-called soft power, has been based on the slow building of enduring individual and institutional relationships with officials, with governments and other players in the countries concerned, and a resulting trust and joint ownership of the outcomes. DFID, Department for International Development, working at country level, is good at this extension of its political and diplomatic influence. More recently, a study by the Institute for Development Studies pointed out that effective aid requires as much investment in relationships as in managing money. And again, most of you will know that DFID has long been viewed as one of the most efficient and effective, innovative aid agencies in the world. And it's widely praised for this. And obviously, as you know, we have a very large development aid budget. It's something like £13 million per year. However, more than 40% of the 0.7% of GNI is now distributed through departments other than DFID. The strategic focus has shifted away from the world's poorest to support aid, and I quote, in the national interest, indicating that judgments on aid packages are based on what best serves and protects our security and our interests. But private sector delivery is often less committed to oversight of aid programs, and the multiplicity of freelance experts, subcontractors, and commercially confidential information makes impact evaluation virtually impossible. Moreover, longer-term evaluation may not be in the interests of the private contractor. It certainly limits any knowledge of local cultures and therefore the likely outcomes. The move towards technical assistance also reflects the changing nature of aid. Technical assistance, such as help in setting up insurance schemes to help farmers when crops fail, is best delivered by the private sector, who advise and run such schemes. But again, while there will be excessive scrutiny of planned and actual expenditure, there is far less, if any, scrutiny on the impact of these schemes, which are usually hugely expensive and less amenable to detailed examination. The growth of a whole industry of private sector companies which exists solely to win development assistance contracts, is truly alarming. Following the 2010 earthquake in Haiti, a sum of something like $6 billion was allocated to a country of 10 million people. 70% of the aid was delivered through private contractors, and as we know, most of us know the outcomes, or the lack of them, are a continuing source of anger amongst the Haitian population. Notably, you will remember the devastating cholera outbreak, the epidemic that occurred in the camps being run by some of the aid agencies. I met with the Haitian ambassador last week and asked him about the aid, and he said to me, and I quote, he said that they were surviving, he said, despite aid. That was his sort of conclusion about the aid. While capital flows and trade far outweigh development aid, the use of public money to incentivize private investment is fine, but it makes it far harder to assess how well the money is spent. Now, all these variables, to which one should add that since development deals with people, much cannot be reliably predicted. And all these factors make it extremely difficult to evaluate anything but the so-called simple achievement of modest goals in proper time, that money has been spent roughly in accordance with the protocols and broadly within the time frame set. And one must ask, therefore, is this enough? I, together with many others, think not. And it's a legitimate question for the public to ask. So let's look at one or two quite well-researched examples. The considerable literature reveals endless, truly endless evaluation studies, but very few long-term and reliable impact studies. Let's take the Lake Victoria Dam in Sri Lanka, a project conceived in the 1970s and completed in 1985. It illustrates the kind of difficulties that arise in the absence of planning based on research. It was aimed, the whole massive project, it was aimed to provide hydroelectricity for a given population and thereby release them from the vagaries of fluctuating oil prices. That was very much a factor in the 1970s. The costs were astronomical, but planned spin-offs included consistent irrigation for several thousand farmers downstream. After more than 20 years operation, it's clear that the power output estimates have consistently fallen far short of predicted levels, and the irrigation catchment area has been significantly smaller than anticipated. Estimates of the irrigation plan did not take into account major factors, such as the leakage rate or the evaporation rate of the reservoir itself. And there have been adverse unintended consequences, an increase in the incidence of malaria in the below dam population, poor water quality affecting lakeside settlements, and a failure to realize other benefits such as fisheries and recreation facilities. An evaluation funded by the UK concluded that the whole project would have benefited from more comprehensive planning and more extensive data at the outset. And I quote, it says, short-term and partial studies by consultants are neither cost-effective nor a professionally adequate substitute. The evaluation report also conceded that proper studies would have required a mass of hydrological, financial, agricultural, social, and environmental data, and that computer modeling developed over a number of years. And which private sector investment company goes in for that kind of investment? One could argue about this particular project that the cost was unacceptable and that the spin-off benefits were unrealistic, and I would argue that. Would it, for example, have been more cost-effective to put the money required for the dam on a money market with a guaranteed return, which would have paid for oil and provided a profit? However, it might have been impossible to predict the investment return rates over the course of the building of the dam, which ran over time anyhow, or the fluctuations in the price of oil. And it's this unpredictability that tends to defeat, or at least deter, long-term impact studies. Let me now add an example nearer to my own field experience, Afghanistan. In 2002, early 2002, after the routing of the Taliban by the US forces, the Bonn Agreement mandated the international community to pour in billions of dollars of aid. and thousands of UN and NGO representatives descended on the capital, Kabul. More than 70% of the first tranche of monies was spent on international salaries. Scores of entourages had private jets and land cruisers to move around the country. Each of the NGOs followed their own agendas. High-level talks between delegates and the government took little account of what was actually needed. For example, the World Bank and other multilaterals decided that the focus must be on primary education, tertiary and even secondary education being considered too much of a luxury for that benighted country. Today, unsurprisingly, there is a pernicious lack of doctors, teachers, engineers, and management experts. One other consequence is that by 2007, the country's operational budget was overshadowed by the cost of technical assistance, which is very expensive. The average Afghan civil servant salary in the early 2000s was $50 US dollars per calendar month. The UN was paying $1,000 per calendar month, with again the predictable massive outflow from government departments when their role in rebuilding a nation after 30 years of savage war was most needed. The aid agencies quickly snapped up drivers and interpreters, again on hugely inflated wages, leaving few English-speaking staff in the government to help with the business of building functional departments. It's estimated from several small village studies in that country that approximately 20% of all aid programs actually reach the people for whom it was intended. The UN, as we know, automatically takes off the first 20% to cover administrative costs in Geneva or wherever. 80% is subcontracted to NGOs, each of which also takes 20% for head office costs and so on. So the aid inflow, far from building infrastructure in Afghanistan, certainly, but in many other countries, undermined what already existed in embryo form, defeating what development aid was mandated to build and to strengthen. There was too little focus on inclusive institutions, on restoring law and order, or even well-researched infrastructural or other public service projects. For example, had a fraction, really a fraction of the aid received been used to upgrade the port in Karachi, which was then working on the basis of a 6-month delay, hundreds of thousands of dollars would have been saved. More generally, it's been reliably estimated that up to 90% of public investment does not actually reach its intended targets. This, my friends, is not unusual, nor is it due to outright corruption, but more due to incompetence, lack of understanding, lack of vision, and the business-as-usual approach. Despite this, we continue to pay lip service to development aid as the answer to combating poverty, and so the cycle of the failure of foreign aid continues. Very simply put, the international aid system is built on the assumption of functioning states, which is certainly not the case in conflict countries. The current system is no longer relevant to the issues of poverty, and therefore to peace. This is recognized by the UN itself, whose own Office of Internal Oversight Services has come up with quite shocking reports that no public company would ever survive. And I quote, vulnerable to fraud, waste, abuse, and mismanagement, quoting again, no effective monitoring of expenditure, hastily prepared projects without internal and meaningful consultation. But little changes because the entire system now has its own momentum. Systems are clearly needed to justify projects and calculate the so-called return rates. But systems do not necessarily reveal everything and are liable to manipulation. That the fact that we do not as yet have all the sophisticated mechanisms to measure outcomes in the medium to long term doesn't mean that we shouldn't continue to focus on the longer term impact. At this stage, a well-informed, plausible narrative by reasonable people of goodwill is not to be sniffed at. But distrust arises when there are discrepancies between what is claimed and what little evidence is actually produced. For example, the Independent Commission on Aid Impact, which was set up by the Tory government relatively recently, about 5 years ago, reviewed cash transfer programs and then pronounced them significant in reducing poverty and vulnerability, and presented a strong value for money case. Much of these cash transfers took the form of microcredit and microfinance schemes. But the large literature on access to finance, especially by women, has a poor record. One respectable study even going so far as to say that many of these projects were counterproductive in the longer term in that they built up unsustainable debt and in some cases reinforced the gender inequalities already present in the society. I mean, that is not to say that some of them don't work. They do, in very limited circumstances, but as a massive program which is sort of grasped by the international community, the evidence does not suggest that this is the way to eliminate poverty, to deliver extra food to children, to ensure that children go to school. All these programs have shown to be to fail in their goals, or at least to be extremely expensive in the small number of people that they actually help. So the mantra, aid works, which is repeated by the aid agencies, a bit like saying Brexit is Brexit. Of course it works. The question is, how well does it work? Does the bold fact that the Asian Development Bank supplied 166,000 households with water, several million got water, tell you as much as you need to know? How much did it cost? How well is the water flowing? What are the maintenance costs? And are maintenance skills being taught? And what is the consequent reduction in disease? And another example that I would give to you, which I have brought up with many of aid agencies, and they get rather cross, is with the sale of malarial nets, bed nets, to reduce malaria, particularly in West African countries, which is, of course, a wonderful idea. They're impregnated with insecticides. But you have to ask questions like, A, do the people who have it, do they have a bed? Because very many of them don't have a bed. What they tend to do is to sell them in the market because they can get money, and money is a much more useful commodity than a net. And yet, the idea that you can estimate the value of mosquito nets by the number of that have been distributed is what the agencies use, very often many agencies use, in their assessment of the outcome of these programs. And I think that the only realistic assessment of the efficacy of these programs would be a reduction in mortality and morbidity from malaria. But no one is actually counting that, maybe because it's very difficult to count, but that would be the key feature, the key sort of a program indicator. Does it matter? Does it matter? Should we spend even more millions on monitoring and evaluation reports and yet more consultants winging their way to underdeveloped countries? On the whole, aid is benevolent and beneficial, it could be argued. But is it? We need to dig deeper because bad aid is dangerous for communities for some of the following reasons. It can preserve the status quo and release governments from undertaking reform and development. It can and does create further divisions between the poor and the not so poor, thereby having the perverse effect of fragmenting states' abilities to perform key functions. It exists as a perpetual reminder of people's dependence on the aid givers. It may protect corrupt governments. In one example, the revenues of the World Bank-funded oil production project were used to buy arms. It contributes to dysfunctional states that breed criminality, terror, and deadly conflict. Now, my friends, I'm going to wind up with that first trite conclusion. Smaller aid projects tend to work when they support what already exists, albeit in embryonic form in a given community. The reasons should be obvious. People in deprived societies tend to make rational and intelligent decisions about their needs. Their survival, a very survivalist testament to this. Supporting local or even regional initiatives allows the community to own the project and encourages entrepreneurs, which I should add is the exact opposite of coercion and conformity with donor values and needs. Such owned projects allow people to be motivated to keep maintaining and developing the project. Leadership issues are sorted out within the community, families invest, children learn, and the projects have a habit of lasting. Many of us here will have seen this in small communities, and it is a joy to witness. However, this approach necessarily entails a great deal of trust on the part of the donor and a willingness to forego quick, mediogenic outcomes for entrenched, locally owned projects. The second conclusion is that unless we know what works, we are continuing to flounder about in a world of massive money transfers with not much to show. In the context of rebuilding society, this is a deeply concerning matter. We are talking not just about shameful waste of taxpayers' money, but about the destructive effects of bad aid. Aid, as I've said, that can and does promote corruption, power struggles, enmity, and about ultimately the further breakdown of society. A bold and rather depressing overall conclusion is that aid, as it is presently conceived, and again I'm talking about this massive bilateral aid and multilateral aid, as it is presently conceived and delivered, is deeply at odds with what is actually needed to rebuild states and communities and eliminate poverty. We don't know what our input achieves in the long term, but we do know that massive rebuilding programs fail, as we see in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in Haiti. We allow political expediency to override investment in infrastructure. We turn a blind eye to the extractive institutions that milk not only aid money, but the potential of too many countries. Failed states, my friends, tend to stay failed. We need a new Bretton Woods agreement on what primary functions the multilateral institutions are really for and how well equipped they are to carry out these functions. We need equally to question the philosophy and practice of the UN and other major development agencies. We need an international debate, an honest debate, on what aid should look like in the decades to come. And most importantly, we need to know how appropriate aid can preempt conflict. I would suggest that the conversation could usefully begin with groups such as this one and expand in the near future to encompass the wider aid community. And that, my friends, is your challenge. Thank you.